So unfortunately, not every single paddle session can be on calm, glassy waters where you can simply cast your stress away, but rather on windy, choppy conditions where it's much harder to paddle and keep your balance. So what do you do if you still want to go out for a paddle in windier conditions but aren't sure how to effectively paddle upwind? Well, don't worry, because I'm about to tell you how with these few simple tips. So starting off, one of the biggest challenges when it comes to paddleboarding in windier conditions is maintaining good balance on your paddleboard. Because without proper balance, you will have a harder time focusing and applying more power into your paddle stroke, therefore making it harder for you to paddle upwind or making it impossible for you to do so at all. So please be cautious when paddleboarding in windier conditions. If you're someone with very little experience paddleboarding, please do not go out in windier conditions at all over 12 knots. So to eliminate this risk, if you're someone who's new to stand-up paddleboarding, start off paddling in calmer waters with a certified instructor or with someone who has tons of experience paddleboarding. Then when you're ready to start progressing to stronger winds or choppier conditions on the water, once again go with someone who has experience and start paddleboarding upwind first. That way if you get tired, you can still be turned around and come back with the wind to your starting location. Okay, enough about that. Let's now dive into our first tip. All right, let's talk about this first tip, which is standing in a staggered stance position on your paddleboard. Now, normally when you're paddling in calmer flat water conditions, you stand more in a parallel stance, about shoulder width apart on your paddleboard. But when it comes to paddling in choppier conditions, especially going upwind, sometimes it's better to switch to more of a staggered stance on your paddleboard. Now, when you're doing this, I'm not talking about doing a super dramatic staggered stance like a surfing stance trying to paddle upwind. Now, you can do this if you're trying to do a paddleboard race or a sprint in upwind conditions to get a more aggressive stance. But normally, in just going for casual paddles in upwind conditions, you're just simply going to do a slight staggered stance on your paddleboard. The biggest reason why this tip is so helpful and so effective when paddleboarding in windier conditions, as it gives you more control and more stability forward and backward on your paddleboard while still maintaining stability side to side. The reason for this is as you're hitting chop going in upwind conditions, your paddleboard is going up and down through the chop. So by standing in a staggered stance, you're able to control more of how much your board goes up and down through that chop as you're paddleboarding along. Now the second thing to consider when standing in a staggered stance on your paddleboard is where exactly you're standing on your board itself. Sometimes you'll stand in the middle part of your paddleboard, sometimes you'll stand farther back, as it all depends on the type of swell and the type of chop you have for your paddle session on that day. The main goal is trying to get the nose of your paddleboard to efficiently punch through the chop as you're paddleboarding upwind. What you don't want to happen is your nose of the paddleboard to be digging down into all that chop, making it like a barrier as you push through it every single time. You also don't want the nose of your board to be like super high on the water, so it's catching that wind, pushing you back as well as you're paddleboarding against the wind. So that main goal is you want your nose of your board to be effectively and easily simply gliding through the top part of that chop, pushing through with ease as you get ready to set up for the next chop to punch through as well. So this takes a lot of practice and a lot of just trying things out to see where is the best spot to stand on your paddleboard as you're paddleboarding upwind, as well as maintaining that staggered stance to give you more control and more stability forward and backward as you paddle along. So the second tip we're going to talk about today is your correct posture and sometimes standing in a lower stance in order to help you paddle more effectively upwind. Normally when you're paddleboarding in calmer conditions, you're standing in a little bit higher stance as you're paddleboarding with no wind resistance. But when it comes to paddleboarding against wind, sometimes it's better to have a lower stance and posture, allowing you to have less wind resistance against your body. So in order to do this, sometimes I'll just kind of relax my knees a little bit more, allowing me to have a lower stance as I paddleboard along. Or sometimes as well, if I need to get even lower, I'll take my top hand and I'll slide it down my shaft a little bit into more of a choke stance, allowing me to have a lower stance once again as I paddleboard upwind. Now at the end of the day, this is totally a personal preference, but it's a great tip to try out in your next windy paddleboard session to see if it helps you have more strength and less wind resistance as you paddleboard upwind using a chokehold position in a lower stance. The third tip we're going to talk about today actually makes a massive difference, is one you should start using right away, and that is feathering your paddle blade as you paddleboard upwind. A lot of beginner paddleboarders don't realize that when they're bringing their blade back forward again to bury it, and by keeping it in a flat condition, they're actually pushing against the wind as they bring their blade back forward again. So rather than pushing against the wind with more wind resistance, all you have to do is simply feather your blade by turning it sideways to cut or slice through that wind as you bring it forward. Then you simply level it back out again and bury it for another paddleboard stroke. And once again, once you get back to around your feet and you exit it, start feathering it again to cut through that wind, forward again, level it back out, bury it, and away you go. So the simplest way to do this is I take my top hand and I simply twist it inwards to where it allows my blade to cut through that wind as I bring it forward. Then as I come forward again, I simply take my top hand and twist the blade out flat, bury it, and away I go again. So try it out, even start practicing it on calm conditions to allow your body to get used to those muscle movements as you bring your blade forward every single time. Even for myself, I do this every single time I go for a paddleboard session, whether it's going for a windy condition or a calm condition. That way my body just has that muscle memory to feather the blade no matter what, so I'm ready to go for windy conditions. So the fourth tip we're going to talk about today is your paddle stroke length. Now normally when you're paddleboarding in calm conditions on the water, you have one long consecutive paddle stroke length as you're paddleboarding along with each paddle stroke that you take. When it comes to paddleboarding in upwind conditions, you're now having to deal with chop and swell that is sometimes inconsistent in how far apart it is as you're paddleboarding upwind. Therefore, if you're trying to maintain one consecutive long paddle stroke like you do in flat water, the nose of your board is sometimes going to be hitting the top of the swell, the bottom of the swell, the middle of the swell, and it's going to make you very hard for you to paddleboard more effectively upwind. So what you need to do sometimes is take shorter paddle strokes or sometimes inconsistent paddle strokes, allowing you to take the nose of your board to allow it to hit at the right part of the wave or swell or chop as you paddleboard upwind. Now this takes a lot of practice because you simply have to get used to controlling your paddleboard more effectively with your paddle strokes, allowing you to punch through that chop more efficiently as well. So sometimes you have to set up with a longer paddle stroke to get ready for the next chop you're going to hit, or sometimes it's coming faster, you'll set up with a shorter paddle stroke, allowing you to get the nose of your board in the correct location again. So simply work on this technique as you paddleboard in upwind conditions, trying to control the nose of your board with your paddle stroke length to allow it to hit that chop in the right spot every single time as you're paddleboarding in upwind conditions. So this last tip is more of a safety tip more than anything else, as if you find yourself in a bad situation in the water where the wind becomes too strong for you to paddleboard against as you're standing up, sometimes all you have to do to save yourself in those situations is simply put your paddle down and lay on top of your paddle board in order to have no or little wind resistance as you paddleboard upwind. Then all you're going to do is use your hands like a surfboard and go and swim against that chop or that wind to get back to where you need to go. So as I said, this tip is more for safety reasons, really more than anything else. So if you find yourself in a situation where the conditions are just absolutely crazy, you can't find yourself be able to make any progress paddleboarding upwind, lay down, get the least amount of wind resistance possible, and try to swim upwind in more of a prone position. So at the end of the day, if you learn to apply these few tips and techniques when it comes to paddleboarding in upwind conditions, it actually is a lot of fun to try out. If you're also interested in learning how to paddleboard in downwind conditions, I highly encourage you to check out the video I have about that on my channel as well. In this video, I collaborate with professional SUP athlete Fiona Wild, and she gives you all of her knowledge when it comes to paddleboarding in downwind conditions. So if you're interested in watching that video, go check it out in the link down below. That's it for today's video though, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.